My name is Kendra. I am 34 years old and a former financial auditor. I sat in my meticulously designed dining room staring at the thick stack of legal documents my husband had just slammed onto the mahogany table. My husband Darius was 36 years old and the glamorous CEO of our cosmetics empire. He stood over me with a cold and calculating glare. He looked me right in the eye and declared that he wanted a divorce. He told me he wanted the Buckhead mansion. He told me he wanted the luxury cars. He told me he wanted every single asset we had built together over the last decade. And then came the ultimate betrayal. He explicitly stated that he wanted absolutely nothing to do with our 7-year-old daughter, Aaliyah. He demanded full surrender of his parental rights. My lawyer kept urging me to fight him tooth and nail. But I looked at the man I had loved for 10 years and calmly replied, "Fine, give him everything." Everyone thought I had lost my mind. At the final divorce hearing, I signed over every last asset without hesitation. He smiled smugly, convinced he had won it all. But what he did not know was that I had already won long before we ever stepped into that courtroom. His smile disappeared in an instant, when his own lawyer suddenly turned pale after discovering one hidden clause. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart someone who tried to take everything you worked for. To understand how we reached that devastating moment in our dining room, you have to go back exactly 48 hours earlier. It was a Saturday night in downtown Atlanta. We were hosting the lavish 10th anniversary gala for Onyx Beauty. The ballroom of the luxury hotel was draped in gold and black velvet. Hundreds of the most influential people in the city were clinking crystal champagne glasses and celebrating our success. Onyx Beauty was a brand I had built from the ground up. I was the true mastermind behind the operation. I engineered the chemical formulas for our cosmetics. I secured our supply chain while I was 8 months pregnant. I structured our corporate taxes to ensure we survived our first difficult years. But if you looked at the stage that night, you would never know I existed. Darius was standing under the bright spotlight, soaking up the flashbulbs of the local press. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo and flashing his signature charming smile. He spoke into the microphone, taking 100% of the credit for the success of the brand. He told a fabricated story about his solitary vision and his relentless late nights. He completely erased my decade of sacrifice and hard work from the narrative. I sat quietly at the VIP table near the front of the stage, watching my husband rewrite our history to feed his own ego. I had always preferred working in the laboratory or managing the financial spreadsheets rather than seeking public validation. But watching him erase me so effortlessly felt like a physical blow. As I sat there clapping politely for the man who was claiming my accomplishments as his own, the seat next to me was taken by my sister-in-law, Tanya. Tanya was Darius' younger sister. She was an entitled woman who held a phantom executive title at Onyx Beauty. She collected a massive salary but contributed absolutely nothing to the company. She leaned over and picked up a glass of champagne. Her eyes were fixed on her brother as the crowd gave him a standing ovation. She did not even look at me when she started speaking. Her voice was low but dripping with malice. She whispered that it was finally time for Darius to find a wife who actually fit in with the Atlanta elite. She sneered and told me that her brother deserved a woman who knew how to walk a red carpet. She said he was exhausted from being tied down to a tired mother who only knew how to hide in a laboratory and care for a sick child. Our daughter Aaliyah suffers from severe asthma. I had spent countless nights awake holding her and managing her breathing treatments while Darius slept soundly in the guest room so his work performance would not be affected. Tanya knew this. She knew every sacrifice I made for that little girl, yet she weaponized my motherhood against me right there at the VIP table. She smirked and took a sip of her drink, telling me that Darius was preparing to upgrade his life. I felt my stomach drop, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. I kept my face completely neutral and turned my attention back to the stage. The gala continued for another 2 hours. The music blared and the guests danced, but I felt completely isolated in the middle of the crowded room. When the speeches finally concluded, Darius descended from the stage. He was immediately surrounded by well-wishers and board members eager to shake his hand. I waited at our table expecting him to eventually make his way over to me so we could take our obligatory press photographs together. But when Darius finally approached the VIP table, his demeanor was entirely different. He completely bypassed the usual pleasantries. He did not smile. He did not ask how I was enjoying the evening. He stopped right in front of me while Tanya and several keyboard members watched closely. Reaching into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket, he pulled out a thick, folded envelope. He threw it onto the table directly in front of me. The heavy paper landed against my dinner plate with a dull thud. He looked down at me with an expression of pure contempt. He did not ask for a divorce. He demanded it right there in the middle of our 10th anniversary celebration. He told me to open the envelope and read the terms. He spoke loud enough for his sister and the board members to hear every single word. He expected me to shatter into pieces. He anticipated that I would burst into tears, beg him to reconsider, and cause a massive hysterical scene that would only prove to his friends that I was unstable and unfit for his world. Instead of crying, I slowly picked up the envelope. I opened the seal and pulled out the legal documents. I scanned the first page, reading the brutal demands he had laid out. He wanted full ownership of the company I had built with my own hands. He wanted the house I had turned into a home. He wanted everything. The sheer audacity of his demands momentarily paralyzed me. But then a sudden icy clarity washed over my mind. My face hardened into an unreadable mask. I looked up from the papers and locked eyes with my husband. The sharp, tense standoff stretched between us for several agonizing seconds. I realized in that exact moment that my entire decade of unwavering loyalty and sacrifice had just been weaponized against me. The man I had supported through every failure and celebrated through every triumph was looking at me like I was an enemy to be destroyed. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink in his face. I simply placed the papers back into the envelope and stood up from the table. I smoothed the front of my dress and nodded to the board members as if nothing unusual had just occurred. I walked out of the ballroom, leaving Darius and his sister staring after me in total shock. They thought my silence meant I was surrendering. They thought my lack of tears meant I was broken and defeated. They had absolutely no idea that my silence was not surrender. It was the sound of a woman calculating exactly how to burn their kingdom to the ground. I stepped out into the warm Atlanta night air and pulled out my phone. The city skyline glittered in the distance, a beautiful reminder of the empire I had helped construct from nothing. I inhaled the humid breeze, letting it fill my lungs and steady my racing heart. My thoughts shifted immediately to Aaliyah, my sweet, innocent daughter who was currently at home, fast asleep, completely unaware that her own father had just carelessly discarded her like an unwanted piece of luggage. He had made the biggest mistake of his entire life by underestimating a mother protecting her child. I unlocked my phone screen and opened a new message to my legal team. I typed out a very quick set of strict instructions to set my plan into motion. The battle had officially begun, and I was already 10 steps ahead of them. The sun rose over the Buckhead estate, casting long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the home office. I walked in carrying a single cup of black coffee. Darius was already sitting behind his massive oak desk, looking like a king surveying his conquered territory. He did not offer me a seat. He simply pushed a thick stack of revised legal documents toward the edge of the desk. He told me he was taking 100% of Onyx Beauty. He wanted the $3 million mansion we were currently standing in. He demanded sole control over our entire diversified investment portfolio. He spoke with a chilling casualness, as if he were ordering a coffee, rather than dismantling my entire life. He leaned back in his leather chair and told me I was lucky he was not going after my personal savings account. He claimed he built the empire with his own sweat and charisma. He actually used the word charisma. I stood perfectly still, letting his arrogance fill the room. I did not remind him that my chemical engineering degree formulated every single product. I did not remind him that my financial auditing background kept us out of bankruptcy during our second year. I just watched him gloat. He wanted to see me break. He wanted me to fall to my knees and plead for a sliver of the company I had birthed. Instead, I took a slow sip of my coffee and asked him what else he wanted. He tapped his gold pen against the mahogany wood, staring at me with a mixture of amusement and disdain. He told me that my compliance was refreshing. He insisted that I leave the house with only the clothes I brought into the marriage. He wanted the artwork, the imported furniture, and the custom laboratory equipment stored in the basement. He wanted to wipe my existence from the property entirely. He told me the lawyers had already drawn up the transfer deeds, and all I needed to do was sign on the dotted line. He spoke about our shared history like a bad business deal he was finally liquidating. He adjusted his silk tie and smiled an empty, terrifying smile. I felt a surge of adrenaline pulse through my veins, but I kept my breathing slow and measured. I let him lay out every single greedy demand. I let him paint himself into a corner of absolute arrogance. He was so consumed by his desire to humiliate me that he was missing the fatal flaw in his own strategy. He was taking the visible wealth, but he had never understood the invisible architecture of our corporate structure. I nodded slowly, indicating that I was processing his demands. He smirked, thinking he had completely broken my spirit. Then he delivered the blow he assumed would destroy me entirely. He casually stated he was relinquishing all parental rights to Aaliyah. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen, but my face remained perfectly impassive. He leaned forward and crossed his arms over his chest. He complained that Aaliyah and her severe asthma required far too much attention. He called my parenting obsessive and suffocating. He said having a sick 7-year-old dragging him to hospitals and specialists was ruining his lifestyle and damaging his public image. He told me he needed freedom to travel and expand his brand without the anchor of a medically fragile child weighing him down. He claimed she was constantly wheezing and coughing when he had important guests over for dinner. He actually had the nerve to say her medical equipment clashed with the aesthetic of the house. I listened to the man I married call our daughter an anchor. I listened to him complain about the child I had carried and nurtured and fought to keep healthy. But beneath the sickening cruelty of his words, I immediately deduced his true motive. Darius did not care about lifestyle constraints or aesthetics. He cared exclusively about money. Aaliyah required expensive daily treatments, top-tier specialists, and premium insurance coverage. By legally severing his parental rights, he was preemptively shielding himself from paying a single cent of child support. He wanted to walk away with a $50 million company and leave me to shoulder the massive financial weight of our child's medical care entirely alone. He was calculating, ruthless, and entirely predictable. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg him to stay in her life, to threaten him with lawyers, to scream that a daughter needs her father. He anticipated a massive emotional outburst that would validate his decision to leave a crazy woman. He wanted a fight. He wanted me to plead for his presence in her life. He wanted to feel like a god deciding the fate of his subjects. He sat there waiting for the tears to fall, waiting for the inevitable breakdown that would stroke his colossal ego. I stared at his impeccably groomed face and saw nothing but a stranger. The man who had held my hand in the delivery room was gone, replaced by a corporate monster driven entirely by greed. He tapped his fingers impatiently against the desk, demanding a response. He asked me if I understood the severity of his terms. He asked me if I was finally ready to accept reality. He pushed a separate stack of papers toward me, declaring them to be the custody arrangement. He told me I would have sole physical and legal custody, effective immediately upon the finalization of the divorce. He added that he would not seek visitation rights because his schedule simply would not allow for it. He spun his abandonment as a gift to me, claiming I always wanted to be the primary parent anyway. I watched his mouth move, forming words that should have shattered my heart into a million irreparable pieces. But my heart was already encased in armor. He leaned back, placing his hands behind his head, waiting for the hysterical maternal reaction he was so sure would come. He wanted the satisfaction of rejecting my pleas. Instead, a cold, calculating light flashed in my eyes. I suppressed the raging inferno of my maternal fury. I locked it away in a steel box inside my mind and threw away the key. I looked at this hollow, pathetic excuse for a man and felt nothing but clinical precision. I told him I agreed to his terms. The smug grin on his face faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by brief confusion. He dropped his hands and asked me to repeat myself. I set my coffee mug down on a coaster, carefully aligning it perfectly. I told him I agreed that he was entirely unfit to raise Aaliyah. I agreed that his presence in her life was a massive liability. I told him I would gladly take 100% physical and legal custody. I watched his ego war with his profound relief. His relief easily won the battle. He chuckled, calling me reasonable for once in my life. He thought he had completely outsmarted me. He thought he had successfully dumped his biggest financial burden while keeping the golden goose all to himself. He had absolutely no idea that by walking away from Aaliyah, he was voluntarily walking away from the only entity that actually held the keys to his precious kingdom. I needed him completely detached from her legally and financially. I needed an ironclad severance that no judge in the state of Georgia could ever overturn. I needed his greed to blind him to the reality of what he was actually signing away. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh legal pad. I told him we were not waiting for the final mediation to finalize this specific detail. I demanded he draft and sign a preliminary binding affidavit right then and there. I dictated the terms clearly and sharply. The affidavit stated he was voluntarily surrendering all parental rights permanently. More importantly, I included a specific clause explicitly refusing any financial connection to Aaliyah or any future assets held in her name. He grabbed his favorite gold-plated pen. He did not even bother to read the phrasing carefully. He was too blinded by the prospect of escaping child support. He scribbled his signature across the bottom of the page with a massive flourish. He signed it with a smug grin, thinking he had just successfully discarded his burdens. He handed the paper back to me like it was a piece of trash. I carefully reviewed the signature, ensuring every single legal requirement was met. I slid the affidavit into a protective sleeve and placed it securely back into my briefcase. I possessed exactly what I needed to destroy him forever. I stood up and turned away from his massive desk. He told me to pack up immediately. I did not look back as I walked out the door. Just 2 days later, the true depth of his cruelty invaded the very sanctuary I had designed. The divorce proceedings had barely been filed, and the legal ink was not even dry. I was in the kitchen preparing a breathing treatment for Aaliyah when the heavy custom mahogany front doors of the Buckhead mansion swung wide open. Darius strutted into the grand foyer, but he did not walk in alone. He was holding the hand of Chloe, our 24-year-old newly promoted director of public relations. She was wearing a tailored designer suit that I had actually approved the budget for the previous quarter. She carried an oversized luxury handbag and looked around the grand entrance with the hungry eyes of a conqueror claiming a new territory. Darius had not even waited for the mediation to finalize. He brought his mistress directly into our shared home while my daughter and I were still breathing the air inside it. It was a calculated move designed to shatter me completely and force a hysterical reaction. I stood at the edge of the marble kitchen island and watched them parade into the living room. Chloe let out a loud artificial laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She immediately began pointing at my carefully curated artwork and imported rugs, dictating what needed to be thrown in the garbage. She strutted past the kitchen without even acknowledging my presence. She climbed the grand sweeping staircase as if she owned every single square inch of the property. I followed quietly, keeping my distance to observe her audacity. Chloe marched straight into the master suite that Darius and I had shared for years. She threw open the doors to my massive walk-in closet. Instead of neatly boxing my belongings, she pulled a roll of heavy-duty black trash bags from her designer tote. She began aggressively yanking my custom-tailored suits, my silk evening gowns, and my expensive shoes off their velvet hangers. She shoved my entire professional wardrobe into the plastic garbage bags like they were worthless rags. She tossed the bags out into the hallway with dramatic sighs of disgust. She loudly complained to Darius that the closet smelled too much like a boring corporate auditor and desperately needed a complete fumigation before she could move her things inside. Darius simply leaned against the doorframe, watching her destroy my property with a sickening smirk of approval. But Chloe was not satisfied with merely taking over the master suite. Her ambition required more space. She marched down the hallway and stopped right in front of Aaliyah's playroom. This was a room I had personally hand-painted with a beautiful mural of a magical forest. It held Aaliyah's favorite books, her specialized medical equipment, and the soft mats where we spent countless hours reading together. Chloe snapped her fingers and signaled to a crew of 3 burly movers she had apparently hired and brought along. She ordered the men to immediately tear down the bookshelves and pack every single toy into cardboard boxes. She loudly declared that the natural lighting in the playroom was far too good to waste on a child's messy playground. She announced her grand vision to convert my daughter's safe haven into her own personal Pilates and yoga studio. She instructed the movers to rip up the soft carpeting because it would interfere with her expensive exercise equipment. I watched the movers carelessly toss Aaliyah's stuffed animals and learning blocks into brown boxes. The sheer disrespect was staggering. They were physically dismantling my child's world, while her father stood casually in the hallway checking his expensive watch. He did not defend his daughter's space. He did not tell his mistress to stop. He facilitated the destruction. Before I could even process the visual of the movers ripping up the playroom carpet, the front doorbell rang again. Tanya walked through the double doors, carrying a tray of iced coffees and a stack of expensive interior design magazines. Darius' younger sister had arrived to help the new mistress redecorate my home. Tanya spotted me standing near the kitchen island, where I had retreated to finish preparing Aaliyah's medication. She handed the coffees to one of the movers and zeroed in on me like a predator spotting wounded prey. She strutted into the kitchen, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. She cornered me deliberately, blocking my path to the hallway. Tanya crossed her arms and laughed right in my face. It was a harsh, grating sound filled with years of pent-up jealousy and spite. She leaned in close, invading my personal space, and told me that blood is thicker than water. She said the entire family was thrilled to finally see me getting thrown out into the street. She sneered and told me that nobody in the family had ever liked my stuck-up independent attitude anyway. She said I always acted like I was the smartest person in the room just because I understood corporate tax structures. She mocked my conservative business clothes and my dedication to the laboratory. She told me Chloe was a breath of fresh air and exactly the kind of vibrant, youthful energy her brother needed to elevate his brand. Tanya gloated that the family was completely united behind Darius and Chloe. She warned me not to fight the divorce because I did not have a single ally left in the entire state of Georgia. She finished her tirade by explicitly telling me to pack my miserable little bags and get out of their beautiful mansion before the end of the day. Any normal person would have exploded. Any normal woman would have grabbed a kitchen knife or screamed until her vocal cords bled. Darius and Tanya were desperately banking on that exact reaction. They wanted me to lose control. They needed me to become the unstable, hysterical ex-wife so they could justify their unimaginable cruelty to their high society friends. But I refused to give them a single ounce of satisfaction. I ignored their taunts entirely. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not argue with Tanya about her pathetic phantom job or her brother's impending financial doom. I simply picked up Aaliyah's nebulizer and the small container of her medication. I looked directly through Tanya as if she were completely invisible. My absolute lack of response caused her smug smile to falter. I stepped around her frozen figure and walked calmly down the hallway toward Aaliyah's bedroom. My entire focus narrowed to a single objective. I needed to shield my daughter from this toxic, chaotic environment. I quietly entered Aaliyah's room and softly closed the door, shutting out the loud voices and the sounds of the movers destroying the playroom. Aaliyah was sitting on her bed, reading a book, completely oblivious to the hostile takeover happening just outside her door. I smiled warmly at my daughter. I sat beside her and gently administered her breathing treatment. I spoke to her in a soothing, melodic voice, asking her about the story she was reading. I told her we were going to go on a special adventure, just the two of us. I pulled a single medium-sized suitcase from the top shelf of her closet. I packed only what was strictly necessary. I gathered her essential medical supplies, her school uniforms, her favorite pajamas, and exactly 3 of her most cherished books. I did not pack a single unnecessary item. I did not rush. I folded her clothes with meticulous precision, smoothing out every single wrinkle. I moved with the calm, deliberate grace of a queen preparing for war. I left behind the custom dollhouse. I left behind the expensive dresses Darius had bought for photo opportunities. I packed only the authentic necessities of our lives. Once her bag was ready, I moved to the guest room where I had slept the previous night. I pulled out my own sleek black suitcase. I bypassed the trash bags full of designer gowns Chloe had thrown into the hallway. I did not need them where I was going. I packed my tailored suits, my essential auditing software drives, and my crucial legal documents. I packed nothing else. When I finally emerged from the guest room, rolling my suitcase with one hand and holding Aaliyah's hand with the other, the atmosphere in the hallway had shifted. Chloe was standing near the staircase, holding a clipboard and barking orders at the movers. But as she watched me glide silently down the hallway, her voice trailed off. She stared at me with wide, uncertain eyes. My profound silence unnerved her deeply. She was young and inexperienced in the art of psychological warfare. She had prepared herself for a screaming match. She had prepared for a physical altercation. She had absolutely no idea how to handle a woman who looked at her with pure clinical indifference. I did not glare at her. I did not insult her. I treated her with the exact same disregard I would give a speck of dust on the bottom of my shoe. Chloe shifted uncomfortably and looked toward Darius for reassurance. She whispered something to him, pointing nervously in my direction. Darius laughed, a loud booming sound meant to project absolute confidence. He wrapped his arm around Chloe's waist and kissed her cheek right in front of me. He loudly assured his mistress that there was absolutely nothing to worry about. He claimed my silence meant I was completely broken. He confidently announced that I was simply in a state of severe shock. He told Chloe that weak women always freeze when they realize they have been thoroughly defeated. He boasted that I had finally accepted my place at the bottom of the food chain. I paused at the top of the grand staircase, holding my daughter's hand tightly. I listened to his arrogant assessment of my mental state. He truly believed he had orchestrated a flawless victory. He thought stripping my closet and invading my home was the ultimate display of dominance. He was too foolish to realize that the mansion and the clothes were merely superficial distractions. I did not care about the silk dresses in the garbage bags. I did not care about the mahogany furniture. I only cared about the intellectual property, the patents, and the foundational trust that secretly controlled his entire fake empire. His grand illusion of success was built on a legal landmine I had planted 3 years ago. I smiled, a very small, invisible smile. I led Aaliyah down the sweeping marble staircase, stepping gracefully toward the front doors. I let Darius believe his own delusional narrative. I let Chloe believe she was the new queen of a wealthy kingdom. I let Tanya believe she had successfully chased me away. Their collective ignorance was my greatest weapon. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I mentally prepared for the next phase of the battle. I knew exactly what Darius was going to do next to force my compliance. He was going to try and cut off my blood supply. But I was ready. I did not look back at the grand foyer. I walked out into the sunlight. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind us, sealing Darius inside his illusion. The sudden quiet of the driveway was a stark contrast to the chaotic invasion occurring inside the mansion. I loaded our 2 modest suitcases into the trunk of my reliable sedan. I buckled Aaliyah into her booster seat, making sure she was comfortable and secure. She looked up at me with large, trusting eyes and asked if we were going on a vacation. I stroked her soft hair and told her we were embarking on a very important journey to a brand new castle. I closed her door and walked around to the driver's side. I paused for a fraction of a second, placing my hand on the warm metal of the car roof. I took one final look at the imposing 3-story brick estate. It was a beautiful structure, but it had always lacked a true foundation of warmth and honesty. I felt absolutely zero attachment to the bricks and the mortar. My entire focus was completely locked on the future. I knew Darius would not stop at simply invading the house. His narcissistic need for total annihilation meant he would inevitably escalate his tactics within the next few hours. He needed me destitute and desperate before the final mediation papers were signed. He needed to ensure I could not afford to hire aggressive legal counsel to scrutinize the corporate documents. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The dashboard clock glowed brightly, indicating it was early afternoon. I pulled out of the long, winding driveway, leaving the chaos, the disrespect, and the mockery far behind me. I navigated the busy Atlanta streets with total precision, heading toward the pharmacy to run an essential errand before proceeding to our secure temporary housing. I knew the real war was just beginning, and Darius was about to play his next predictable card. I pulled my sedan into the parking lot of our local luxury pharmacy. The afternoon sun was beating down, but my mind was focused on the task. Aaliyah sat quietly holding her picture book. I held her small hand as we walked through the sliding doors. The air conditioning hit us instantly, providing relief from the Atlanta heat. We headed straight for the pharmacy prescription counter. Mr. Henderson, the pharmacist, had known Aaliyah since she was a baby. He smiled warmly when he saw us approaching and immediately went to retrieve her specialized asthma inhalers and customized nebulizer solutions. These were not generic medications. They were premium, highly specialized pharmaceutical compounds that cost a small fortune every single month. Darius knew exactly how much they cost. He also knew that Aaliyah needed a fresh supply by this evening. Mr. Henderson placed the white paper bags on the counter and tapped a few buttons on his keyboard. He announced the total with a sympathetic smile. It was nearly $3,000 for the monthly supply. I reached into my designer wallet and pulled out our primary premium joint credit card. It was a heavy platinum card that Darius and I used for all major household and medical expenses. I handed it to the pharmacist without a second thought. I watched him swipe the magnetic strip through his terminal. He waited for the approving beep, but instead the machine let out a sharp, obnoxious buzzing sound. A small red error message flashed across the digital screen. Mr. Henderson frowned and tried running the card a second time. He wiped the magnetic strip against his crisp white lab coat, assuming it was simply a reading error. He swiped it again. The machine buzzed louder. He looked up at me with an apologetic expression and told me the card had been completely declined. I felt a tiny prickle of annoyance but pushed it aside. I assumed the bank had flagged the massive transaction for fraud protection, given the recent unusual activity on our accounts. I calmly reached back into my wallet and pulled out a secondary joint card. This one was a high-limit rewards card connected directly to our primary checking account. I handed it over and told him to try it instead. He processed the second card. The machine buzzed again. Declined. The word flashed on the screen like a neon warning sign. A cold, heavy realization began to settle in the pit of my stomach. This was not a bank error. This was a deliberate, calculated attack. Mr. Henderson looked extremely uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He asked if I had another form of payment or if I needed to make a quick phone call to the bank. Aaliyah tugged at the hem of my blouse and asked if everything was okay. I looked down at her innocent face and smiled reassuringly. I told her everything was perfectly fine and asked her to go look at the coloring books in the next aisle while I sorted out a silly computer glitch. Once she was safely out of earshot, I stepped away from the counter and pulled out my cell phone. I dialed the direct concierge line for our private wealth management bank. The automated system recognized my number and routed me immediately to a customer service representative. I verified my identity and asked why my cards were being declined. The representative placed me on a brief hold. When she returned, her voice was clipped and overly professional. She informed me that Darius had personally contacted the bank exactly 1 hour ago. He had executed a complete financial freeze on every single joint account bearing my name. He had canceled all of my credit cards. He had locked me out of the family checking accounts, the emergency savings, and the liquid investment portfolios. He had effectively cut off my access to every single dollar we shared. The representative apologized, stating she could not override the primary account holder's directives without a court order. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my purse. The sheer audacity of his strategy was almost breathtaking. He knew I needed Aaliyah's medication today. He deliberately waited until the exact moment I would be at the pharmacy to sever my financial lifeline. He was trying to starve me out. He wanted to paralyze me with fear and desperation. He calculated that if he cut off my access to cash, I would panic. He assumed I would run back to the mansion with tears streaming down my face, begging him for the funds to buy our daughter's breathing treatments. He wanted me so desperate that I would sign the final divorce decree, immediately accepting his brutal terms without daring to fight for alimony or a fair division of assets. He was using his own child's health as leverage to force my absolute surrender. He thought he had completely trapped me. He thought he had cut off my oxygen. But Kendra Wilson does not panic. Kendra Wilson calculates. I walked back to the pharmacy counter with my head held high and my spine straight. Mr. Henderson looked at me with concern, preparing to offer me a few free samples to tide me over. I smiled politely and shook my head. I unzipped the inner lining of my designer wallet, revealing a hidden compartment tucked behind the silk fabric. I reached inside and pulled out an obsidian black corporate card. It did not have Darius written on it. It did not even have the name Onyx Beauty on it. It was issued under a completely different LLC that I had quietly established 2 years ago to manage my own independent consulting revenue and intellectual property patents. I had built my own financial fortress entirely outside of my husband's arrogant purview. I handed the black card to the pharmacist. He ran it through the machine, and within 2 seconds a cheerful chirp echoed through the quiet store. The payment went through instantly. I thanked Mr. Henderson, gathered the white paper bags filled with life-saving medication, and called for Aaliyah. I held my daughter's hand as we walked out of the store and climbed back into my sedan. I needed to return to the mansion one last time. In my retreat earlier, I had deliberately left our 2 suitcases sitting just inside the grand foyer. I had known Darius would check the bank alerts and realized the cards were declining. I wanted him to be physically present when I made my final triumphant exit. I drove the sedan back up the long winding driveway of the Buckhead estate. I parked the car near the grand entrance, leaving the engine running and the cool air conditioning flowing. I gently took little Aaliyah by the hand, and together we walked slowly up the stone steps. I pushed open the heavy front doors. The mansion was quieter now. Chloe and Tanya were nowhere to be seen, probably upstairs plotting more childish renovations, but Darius was waiting for me. He stood squarely in the middle of the expansive foyer, intentionally blocking my path to the suitcases. His muscular arms were crossed tightly across his chest, and a triumphant smirk danced across his handsome face. He looked at me eagerly, expecting to see a broken, defeated woman. He anticipated flowing tears. He fully expected a frantic, begging plea for mercy or a desperate, humiliated request for basic grocery money. He wanted me to beg him to unfreeze the checking account so our daughter could finally breathe. He was practically vibrating with the cruel anticipation of my total submission and humiliation. I stopped right in front of him. I did not say a single word. I did not acknowledge his pathetic attempt to exert financial dominance over me. I simply looked right through his eyes as if he were nothing more than a transparent, irrelevant ghost haunting a beautiful house I no longer cared about. The profound, heavy silence unnerved him immediately. His arrogant smirk faltered as confusion clouded his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to deliver whatever cruel, manipulative ultimatum he had rehearsed in his mind. But I refused to give him an audience. I reached down, grabbed the handles of my 2 suitcases, called for my daughter, and stepped smoothly around his frozen, paralyzed figure. He stood there completely paralyzed by my utter lack of submission. I walked out into the Atlanta night. I did not look back at the life I was leaving or the man who had tried to destroy me. I pulled the front door firmly shut behind me. As the brass lock clicked into place, severing my ties to that house forever, I pulled out my cell phone. I opened a secure messaging app and typed a quick text to my powerhouse attorney, who was waiting for my signal. Let him think he cut my oxygen. Push the final mediation to Friday. 7 days passed since I walked out of that mansion. 7 days since I sent that text to my attorney. Darius did not reach out to me directly. He did not ask to speak to our daughter. He did not try to negotiate the terms of his surrender. Instead, he chose a completely different battlefield. He decided to wage a war of public perception. He unleashed a vicious, coordinated smear campaign across the most affluent and exclusive African-American social circles in Atlanta. He and his sister Tanya worked in tandem to completely assassinate my character. They did not use lawyers or legal briefs for this phase of their attack. They used the poisonous whisper network of country club group chats and the highly trafficked society blogs that catered to the city elite. Tanya became his chief propagandist. She spent her days lounging at the country club pool, sending out hundreds of encrypted messages to the wives of Atlanta executives. She painted a picture of a household in absolute crisis, deliberately twisting the truth to fit her narrative. Darius knew exactly how to manipulate the narrative. He was a master of public relations, and he used every single skill he possessed to paint himself as the ultimate victim. The rumors began as subtle insinuations before escalating into outright fabrications. Tanya planted stories claiming I had suffered a severe catastrophic mental break. She told anyone who would listen that the stress of raising a child with severe asthma had completely fractured my sanity. She claimed my sudden departure from the mansion was an erratic manic episode and that I had abandoned my duties as a wife and a business partner. But they did not stop at attacking my mental stability. They attacked my professional integrity. Darius leaked anonymous tips to local business journals, suggesting that he was forced to fire me from Onyx Beauty because I had been secretly siphoning corporate funds into offshore accounts. He spun a brilliant, devastating lie. He told our mutual friends and investors that he had endured years of a toxic, manipulative marriage just to protect the brand we built together. He painted himself as the long-suffering martyr who finally had to sever ties to save the company and protect his employees from my alleged financial crimes. He even shed fake tears during an emergency board meeting, claiming my departure was the hardest decision of his life. The speed and efficiency of the social fallout were staggering. My cell phone, which used to ring constantly with invitations and favors, suddenly went completely silent. Women who had kissed my cheek and drank my champagne just 2 weeks prior at our anniversary gala completely vanished. The wealthy socialites who had begged me for exclusive cosmetic samples and early access to our new product lines acted like I no longer existed. My calendar had been filled with charity board meetings, luncheon dates, and exclusive gala appearances. Within exactly 48 hours, every single engagement was canceled. The president of the Pediatric Hospital Foundation sent me a brief, sterile email requesting that I step down from my position on the board of directors, citing the recent distracting media attention surrounding my personal life. Former friends blocked my number. Women I had mentored pretended they did not see me when I walked past them in the city. I decided to test the waters by attending a scheduled lunch at an exclusive bistro in Buckhead. The hostess, who usually greeted me by name, suddenly could not find my reservation. When I was finally seated in a dark corner near the kitchen, I watched 3 different women I had known for years actively turn their heads to avoid making eye contact. Darius had successfully turned me into a social pariah. He effectively excommunicated me from the glittering world we had inhabited for a decade. He expected this total isolation to break my spirit. He assumed that losing my status and my social circle would force me to crawl back to him, begging for a public retraction and a quiet settlement. He fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had married. I did not care about the social noise. I did not care about the galas or the country club gossip. While Darius was desperately playing a petty social game, I was playing chess. I ignored every single blog post and every fabricated rumor. I secured a temporary ultra-modern penthouse in the heart of Midtown Atlanta. It was a sleek, minimalist fortress of glass and steel, hovering high above the city skyline. It was the exact opposite of the heavy, traditional Buckhead estate. It represented my new reality, clean, transparent, and completely unburdened. The penthouse featured stark white walls, polished concrete floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the bustling city below. I set up a massive command center in the primary living space. I pushed aside the modern glass dining table and covered every inch of the surface with thousands of pages of complex legal documents, corporate tax returns, and foundational business filings. I spent my days and nights systematically reviewing every single contract related to Onyx Beauty. I sat in absolute silence with a yellow highlighter illuminating specific hidden clauses and obscure corporate bylaws. I maintained a chilling, laser-focused composure. I did not cry over lost friendships. I did not waste a single ounce of energy feeling sorry for myself. I meticulously traced the invisible architecture of the empire Darius thought he owned. I reviewed the original patent applications I had filed long before Onyx Beauty ever became a household name. I scrutinized the holding companies and the shell corporations Darius had set up, assuming I would never look closely at the paperwork. I found every hidden asset and every misdirected fund. I drank black coffee and built a watertight legal trap. Darius was busy attending high society dinners with Chloe on his arm, soaking up the manufactured sympathy of his wealthy peers. He was focused on winning the court of public opinion. He was completely blind to the fact that public opinion held absolutely zero legal weight in the boardroom. He was throwing a temper tantrum in the press while I was quietly dismantling his financial life support. I watched the city lights blink to life each evening from my penthouse windows, feeling an immense sense of power. The isolation he forced upon me was actually a tremendous gift. It removed all distractions. It allowed me to focus entirely on the execution of my strategy. I reviewed the binding affidavit he had so willingly signed, relinquishing his parental rights and shielding himself from child support. I placed it securely in a fireproof safe alongside the explosive corporate documents I had gathered. I printed out the original operating agreement for Onyx Beauty. I highlighted the specific paragraph that detailed intellectual property ownership. Darius had always assumed the brand name was the most valuable asset. He had spent millions marketing the logo and the packaging. But the true value of a cosmetics empire lies in the proprietary chemical formulas. The specific combination of ingredients that made our serums and creams actually work. I had engineered every single one of those formulas in a laboratory before Darius even knew what a supply chain was. I had registered the patents under my separate holding company, the same company connected to the black corporate card I used at the pharmacy. Onyx Beauty was merely licensing those formulas from me. Darius was essentially renting his entire product line from his wife. He was so arrogant that he had never bothered to read the fine print of our licensing agreements. He assumed because he was the face of the company that he was the brain of the company. I organized the documents into perfectly aligned stacks. I prepared the ultimate counteroffensive. The smear campaign raging outside my windows meant absolutely nothing. The socialites whispering about my mental health were irrelevant. They were fighting a phantom war, while the real battle lines were drawn in black ink and binding legal statutes. I sipped my coffee and read through a particularly damaging email chain I had recovered from the corporate server. It detailed Darius and Tanya illegally moving company funds to cover personal luxury expenses. It was pure textbook embezzlement. They had left a digital paper trail a mile wide. I added it to the stack designated for my attorney. My daughter Aaliyah was safe and thriving in her new environment, completely shielded from the toxicity of her father. She played happily in the spacious living area of the penthouse while I constructed her financial future. The smear campaign was a desperate attempt by a weak man to seize control of a narrative he had already lost. He thought he was burying me under a mountain of public shame. He did not realize I was the master architect now. I knew Friday was going to be a very bloody day in court indeed. Friday morning arrived with a crisp clarity that perfectly matched my internal state. The mediation was scheduled for 10 o'clock sharp in the largest conference room of DeAndre's firm. I wore a tailored slate gray suit that projected absolute clinical professionalism. My hair was pulled back into a severe, immaculate bun. I arrived 30 minutes early and took my seat at the far side of the massive mahogany table. DeAndre sat beside me, arranging his legal pads with deliberate, agonizing slowness. We did not speak. We did not need to. We were simply waiting for the prey to walk into the slaughterhouse. At exactly 10 minutes past the hour, the heavy glass doors swung open. Darius strutted into the room like a conquering emperor. He was wearing a custom bespoke suit that likely cost more than a luxury car. The fabric gleamed under the recessed lighting. He was flanked by a team of 3 aggressive, high-priced attorneys who moved with the coordinated swagger of hired mercenaries. They carried thick leather briefcases and wore expressions of practiced disdain. Darius did not even glance in my direction when he entered. He took his seat opposite me, radiating an aura of absolute invincibility. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and checked his heavy gold watch with an exaggerated sigh of boredom. Out in the opulent marble lobby, Chloe was comfortably draped across a designer sofa. I had seen her through the glass partitions as we walked in. She was wearing another one of my approved budget outfits, snapping endless selfies with her phone held high. She was undoubtedly updating her social media followers about her stressful day supporting her future husband through his difficult divorce. She was completely oblivious to the financial guillotine suspended directly above her perfectly contoured head. My phone buzzed quietly against the mahogany table. It was a text message from Tanya. She was sitting in her car in the parking garage sending me real-time taunts. The screen illuminated with her vitriol. She told me to sign the papers quickly so I could crawl back to the miserable middle-class life I deserved. She texted that Darius was going to leave me with absolutely nothing, and that the entire city was laughing at my spectacular downfall. I read the messages with a perfectly blank expression. I turned my phone face down and returned my attention to the men across the table. Darius leaned back in his leather chair and nodded to his lead attorney, a man named Sterling who had a reputation for merciless litigation. Sterling did not offer a polite greeting. He did not introduce himself. He simply reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents. He slammed the heavy stack down onto the center of the mahogany table with a loud, echoing thud. The sheer volume of paper was meant to be physically intimidating. Sterling pushed the stack across the smooth wood until it rested directly in front of DeAndre. Sterling began barking his demands with the rapid-fire aggression of a seasoned bully. He stated that his client was prepared to offer a swift and clean resolution to this unfortunate marital dissolution. He pointed a manicured finger at the stack of papers and declared that they contained a comprehensive blanket waiver. The terms were absolutely draconian. They demanded that I surrender every single right to the Onyx beauty brand. They demanded that I relinquish all claims to the Buckhead estate, vacating any remaining personal property by the end of the weekend. Furthermore, they explicitly demanded that I sign away any rights to future earnings generated by the cosmetics empire. They wanted me to walk away with nothing but the clothes on my back and the small balance currently sitting in my personal checking account. Sterling warned us that if we did not sign the waiver today, they would tie me up in litigation for the next decade, draining every cent I had in legal fees. DeAndre picked up the document and adjusted his reading glasses. He flipped through the first few pages with an expression of manufactured horror. He looked at Sterling and let out a sharp bark of disbelief. He slammed his hand on the table, mimicking the exact outrage we had rehearsed. DeAndre loudly protested that the terms were unconscionable. He argued that I had helped build the company from the ground up and was entitled to an equitable split of the marital assets. He played the part of the frustrated protective lawyer beautifully. He raised his voice demanding a fair valuation of the brand and the real estate. Darius watched DeAndre perform, and a sickening smirk spread across his face. He held up his hand, signaling his attack dog to be quiet. He wanted to handle this part himself. He leaned across the wide table, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He locked his arrogant gaze onto mine. He completely ignored DeAndre and spoke directly to me in a voice dripping with condescending pity. He told me that I was being completely irrational. He claimed he was actually doing me a massive favor by taking full ownership of the company. He spun a brilliant, narcissistic narrative right there in the mediation room. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper and claimed that Onyx Beauty was actually drowning in hidden debts. He said the corporate tax structures were too complex for me to understand, and that the brand was facing massive liabilities from aggressive expansion. He painted a picture of a failing company that only he had the business acumen to save. He told me that by taking the company off my hands, he was protecting me from imminent financial ruin. He claimed he was absorbing all the risk out of the goodness of his heart, because he still cared about my well-being despite my recent mental instability. It was a masterful display of gaslighting. He sat there looking immaculate and wealthy, trying to convince me that the highly profitable empire I had built was actually a toxic liability. He wanted me to feel grateful for my own robbery. He wanted me to thank him for stripping me of my life's work. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of clinical indifference. I let him talk. I let him dig the hole deeper. But Darius was not finished. He needed to completely sever every tie. He shifted his posture, his face hardening into a mask of pure cruelty. He brought up our daughter. He stated casually that his new life with Chloe did not include the burden of a sick child. He reiterated his demand for absolute parental severance. He said he wanted the legal termination of his parental rights finalized today right alongside the financial waivers. He claimed Aaliyah was a distraction he could no longer afford. He said a man of his stature could not be tied down by medical emergencies and constant hospital visits. He looked me dead in the eye and said he wanted nothing to do with her. He demanded that I assume full, total, and complete responsibility for her care, her medical bills, and her future. The callousness of his words hung in the cold, conditioned air of the conference room. He was discarding his own flesh and blood with the exact same indifference he used to discard last season's marketing campaign. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. He looked supremely confident. He truly believed he had orchestrated a flawless victory. He was certain that the threat of crushing debt combined with the social isolation of his smear campaign had broken my will. He thought he was watching a defeated woman accept her grim reality. DeAndre shot up from his chair, practically shouting. He threw the blanket waiver back across the table, scattering the pages in front of Sterling. He roared that we would never sign such a predatory document. He threatened to take the case before a judge and expose the hidden assets. He paced the floor, playing the desperate attorney, trying to shield a submissive, traumatized client from complete annihilation. His performance was Oscar-worthy. He generated a level of tension in the room that was almost suffocating. The air crackled with hostility. Darius simply laughed. It was a dark, booming sound that echoed off the glass walls. He turned to his lead attorney and shook his head in mock pity. He told Sterling that some women simply do not know when they have been beaten. He looked back at me, his eyes flashing with raw, unrestrained abuse. He called me ungrateful. He called me delusional. He verbally battered me with a barrage of insults designed to force my immediate compliance. He told me I would be a penniless outcast, scrubbing floors within a year, while he took Onyx Beauty global. He demanded that DeAndre sit down and advise his client to sign the papers right now. I raised my hand. A deliberate motion cut through the toxic air of the conference room. DeAndre halted mid-syllable. His jaw shut, and he slowly sank back into his heavy leather chair. The sudden absolute silence was deafening. The aggressive posturing of Sterling and his team of overpriced legal mercenaries evaporated. They stared at me with varying degrees of confusion. Darius leaned forward, his arrogant smirk momentarily replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He had expected me to scream. He had expected me to throw heavy crystal water glasses across the mahogany table. He had braced himself for a bitter, exhausted negotiation over percentages and alimony. He had prepared for a desperate, hysterical mother begging for child support and a fair division of marital assets. He was entirely unprepared for the absolute freezing temperature of my composure. I looked directly into his eyes. They were the same eyes that had once promised me a lifetime of partnership and loyalty. Now they were just vacant, shallow pools of narcissism and greed. I did not shed a single tear. My tear ducts were completely dry. I did not offer a single argument. I did not attempt to defend my honor or my sanity against his ridiculous fabricated smear campaign. I simply reached across the polished wood and picked up the heavy silver fountain pen Sterling had placed beside the towering stack of documents. The metal was cool against my skin. It felt like a weapon of mass liberation. I pulled the first thick stack of paper toward me. It was the Master Separation Agreement. I turned to the signature page. My hand hovered over the dotted line for a fraction of a second. I thought about the massive brick estate in Buckhead. I thought about the imported marble, the vaulted ceilings, and the custom murals I had painted for my daughter. I thought about the life I had built inside those walls. And then I realized none of it mattered. It was just mortar and glass. I pressed the silver nib of the pen to the heavy parchment and signed my name with sharp, elegant strokes. I pushed that document aside and pulled the next one forward. This was the corporate relinquishment form. It was the document that completely severed my legal ties to the Onyx Beauty brand. It handed Darius full operational control, 100% of the voting shares, and complete ownership of the LLC that held the marketing trademarks. Sterling watched me with wide eyes as the pen scratched across the paper. He could not believe what he was witnessing. No sane attorney would ever advise their client to sign away an empire of this magnitude without a brutal, protracted legal battle. But Sterling did not know what I knew. He did not know about the red-tabbed folder sitting inside DeAndre's briefcase. He did not know that I was handing Darius a beautiful hollow shell, completely devoid of the proprietary chemical formulas that actually generated the revenue. I signed my name again, abandoning the empty husk of onyx beauty to a man who possessed no ability to sustain it. I reached for the third and final stack of documents. This was the most important one. This was the only piece of paper on the mahogany table that actually held any true value. It was the comprehensive custody agreement and the severance of parental rights. Darius had demanded this document. He wanted to be entirely free of the financial and emotional burden of raising a child with severe medical needs. He wanted to enjoy his new life with Chloe without the inconvenience of asthma treatments, hospital visits, or child support payments. He wanted to completely erase Aaliyah from his pristine new reality. I read the specific clauses he had his lawyers draft. He was voluntarily surrendering all legal and physical custody to me. He was legally waiving his right to visitation. He was legally extinguishing his obligation to pay any form of child support, alimony, or medical coverage. He was entirely legally abandoning his own daughter. My heart hardened into a diamond. He thought he was punishing me by leaving me with the sole financial responsibility for our child. He had absolutely no idea he was giving me the greatest gift of my entire life. He was giving me my daughter completely free and clear. He would never be able to use her as a pawn. He would never be able to demand visitation just to disrupt my peace. He would never be able to make medical decisions for her. She was mine. I pressed the pen to the paper for the final time. I signed my name with a flourish, sealing the protective barrier around my child forever. I capped the silver pen and set it down on the table with a soft click. The sound echoed in the quiet room. It was done. Darius lunged forward and snatched the documents from the table. He pulled them toward his chest, as if I might suddenly change my mind and try to rip them back. He rapidly flipped through the pages, checking every single signature line. When he saw that my name was boldly signed on every required page, a massive, triumphant laugh erupted from his chest. It was a loud, obnoxious sound that filled the entire conference room. He looked at Sterling and slapped him on the back. He laughed in pure, unfiltered disbelief at how incredibly easy it had been to break me. He truly believed his psychological warfare had worked perfectly. He thought the high society smear campaign and the frozen credit cards had completely shattered my resolve. He pulled his expensive cell phone from the inner pocket of his bespoke suit. He did not even wait for the lawyers to officially notarize the documents. He immediately started typing a text message. I knew exactly who he was texting. Chloe was sitting down in the marble lobby waiting for the spoils of war to be delivered. He was typing the message to his mistress, gloating that they had won. He was telling her that the Buckhead mansion was entirely theirs. He was telling her that he was the sole, undisputed king of onyx beauty. He was telling her that the irritating burden of his sick child was gone forever. He looked up from his phone screen and flashed me a smile of absolute pure malice. He was celebrating a total victory. He was entirely blind to the impending slaughter. Tanya was probably cheering in her car in the parking garage. The whole pathetic crew was celebrating their grand illusion of success. I sat quietly and watched the celebration of fools. Sterling began organizing the paperwork, snapping the pages into neat, crisp folders. He looked at me with a mixture of professional pity and extreme relief. He had secured a massive win for his firm, and he was eager to get the signed documents filed with the court. Before I realized what a terrible mistake I had supposedly made, I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table and pushed my chair back. The leather squeaked softly against the floor. I stood up to my full height. I smoothed the lapels of my slate-gray blazer. I adjusted my cuffs, ensuring that my appearance remained absolutely flawless. I did not look at Darius again. I had completely erased him from my vision. I turned toward the heavy glass doors. I walked with the slow, measured grace of a woman who had just executed a flawless checkmate. I opened the door and stepped out into the quiet, plush hallway. DeAndre followed immediately behind me, his heavy footsteps matching my steady pace. We walked past the sleek reception desk. We walked past the expensive modern artwork hanging on the walls. We reached the bank of elevators at the end of the corridor. I pressed the silver button to summon the car. The quiet ping signaled its arrival. The polished metal doors slid open. I stepped inside the elevator and DeAndre followed. The heavy doors glided shut, cutting off our view of the law firm. We were completely alone in the descending metal box. DeAndre let out a long, slow breath. He loosened his silk tie and shook his head in absolute amazement. He had played his part perfectly. He had provided the exact amount of outraged resistance necessary to convince Darius that the waiver was a massive victory. DeAndre looked at me. The predatory smile had returned to his face. He leaned against the mirrored wall of the elevator cabin. His voice was low and filled with dark anticipation. He has no idea he just signed his own death warrant. I looked back at DeAndre and met his gaze perfectly, feeling the full, intoxicating weight of my impending triumph settling deep into my bones. Let him enjoy his shiny new kingdom while he still can. The entire foundation is rigged with our dynamite, and I hold the detonator. 30 days evaporated into the sweltering Atlanta summer. The city moved on with its usual relentless rhythm, but for Darius, the month was a glorious, uninterrupted coronation. He emerged from the mediation room not just as a victor, but as a newly minted king. The public narrative he had meticulously crafted alongside Tanya took root and flourished in the fertile soil of high society gossip. He was no longer just the handsome face of onyx beauty. He was the sole undisputed visionary. The local business magazines ate up his fabricated story of survival and corporate triumph. His face graced the glossy cover of Atlanta Executive Monthly. The photograph featured him sitting in a bespoke charcoal suit, leaning confidently across a mahogany desk, with a city skyline visible through the window behind him. The headline printed in bold gold letters read, "The Solo Architect, How Darius Vance Saved Onyx Beauty from the Brink." He gave extensive interviews detailing his supposed struggle. He spoke softly and solemnly about the heavy burden of leadership and the painful decisions he had to make to protect his employees. He painted himself as a brave entrepreneur who had successfully excised a toxic element from his corporate structure. The articles completely erased my existence. They erased my late nights in the laboratory. They erased my supply chain negotiations. They completely omitted the fact that I had engineered every single chemical formula that made the products actually work. Darius soaked up the manufactured adulation like a sponge. He attended exclusive networking luncheons and charity galas, accepting handshakes and sympathetic nods from wealthy peers who believed his lies. He was riding a massive wave of public validation, entirely convinced of his own manufactured brilliance. Behind the scenes of this glittering public relations victory, Darius was orchestrating the biggest financial move of his entire life. The massive exposure from the magazine covers had attracted the attention of a colossal global retail conglomerate. They were an international corporate behemoth looking to aggressively expand their luxury cosmetics portfolio. They saw Onyx Beauty as the perfect acquisition target. Darius sat in high-altitude glass-walled boardrooms, negotiating an exclusive international distribution and total buyout contract. The numbers being thrown across the table were absolutely staggering. The retail conglomerate offered a clean $50 million to acquire the brand lock, stock, and barrel. They promised to put Onyx Beauty products on the shelves of premium department stores in London, Paris, Tokyo, and Dubai. Darius was completely mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of the impending payout. He saw the $50 million as the ultimate validation of his ego. He imagined the sprawling estates he could purchase. He visualized the fleet of exotic cars he could acquire. He sat across from the conglomerate executives, smiling his charismatic media-trained smile, nodding along as they discussed global market penetration and quarterly revenue projections. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he paid absolutely zero attention to the intricate legal details of the impending acquisition. He completely ignored the rigorous due diligence process the conglomerate would eventually execute before transferring a single dollar. He assumed the deal was already a legally binding certainty, simply because they had shaken hands and drafted a preliminary letter of intent. He treated the $50 million as cash, already sitting securely in his personal bank account. This toxic combination of unearned confidence and perceived limitless wealth triggered a catastrophic spending spree. Darius wanted to celebrate his impending windfall immediately. He did not want to wait for the ink to dry on the conglomerate buyout contract. He wanted the lifestyle of a $50 million tycoon right now. To fund this immediate gratification, he sought out a highly aggressive predatory private equity firm. He applied for a massive high-interest bridge loan. He needed millions of dollars in liquid cash to float his extravagant desires until the buyout officially closed. The private equity lenders were ruthless sharks. They demanded extreme collateral to secure the massive loan. Darius did not hesitate for a single second. He casually signed over the deed to the sprawling Buckhead mansion using the estate as the primary collateral. He then pledged 100% of his newly acquired shares in Onyx Beauty to secure the rest of the capital. He literally wagered his entire empire on a deal that had not yet closed. He signed the predatory loan documents with a flourish of his expensive fountain pen, entirely convinced he would pay off the exorbitant interest the moment the $50 million check cleared. He walked out of the private equity firm with millions of dollars in highly leveraged borrowed cash, burning a massive hole in his pocket. Chloe was more than happy to help him spend it. She viewed the bridge loan as her personal, endless shopping budget. The two of them embarked on a reckless display of financial gluttony that shocked even the most jaded members of the Atlanta elite. Chloe hired a team of high-priced interior decorators to completely gut and redesign the Buckhead mansion. She ordered imported Italian marble floors, custom crystal chandeliers, and vintage French furniture. She discarded every single piece of decor I had meticulously chosen, replacing it with gaudy, ostentatious displays of new money. She spent her afternoons lounging in VIP dressing rooms, at exclusive designer boutiques, purchasing rare handbags and custom-tailored gowns. Darius matched her reckless spending dollar for dollar. He bought a rare limited edition sports car, adding to his already absurd collection of luxury vehicles. He commissioned a custom diamond necklace for Chloe that cost more than most people earned in a decade. Together they planned an absurdly lavish European victory tour to celebrate their impending buyout. They chartered a private jet to fly them from Atlanta to the Amalfi Coast. They booked the penthouse suites at the most exclusive luxury hotels in Rome, Paris, and Monaco. They hired private chefs, personal shoppers, and dedicated security details for the entirely unnecessary trip. They were bleeding cash at a terrifying, unsustainable rate, entirely sustained by the illusion of the $50 million mirage hovering just on the horizon. They were throwing enormous, lavish dinner parties at the mansion, serving vintage champagne and imported caviar, boasting to their wealthy friends about their impending global expansion. Tanya watched this tidal wave of borrowed money flowing through the family and immediately demanded her own massive cut. She had been the loyal foot soldier in the public relations war. She had orchestrated the Whisper Network. She had planted the malicious stories in the society blogs. She felt entirely responsible for clearing the path for her brother to claim his throne. She marched into Darius's corner office at the Onyx Beauty headquarters and demanded a reward for her dirty work. She refused to be left behind while Darius and Chloe shopped for Italian villas. She demanded a staggering salary increase that was completely untethered from her actual job responsibilities. She wanted a corporate compensation package that rivaled the top executives of Fortune 500 companies, despite possessing absolutely no applicable business skills. She also handed Darius a glossy brochure for a brand new, incredibly expensive imported sports car. She demanded he purchase it for her immediately as a corporate expense. She framed her demands not as requests but as required payments for her absolute loyalty. Darius sat behind his mahogany desk, completely intoxicated by his own perceived power. A man expecting a $50 million payout does not concern himself with petty financial requests from his sister. He viewed Tanya's demands as insignificant drops in his massive incoming ocean of wealth. He did not consult an accountant. He did not review the company payroll budget. He simply smiled his arrogant, charismatic smile and signed the approval forms. He authorized the absurd salary increase immediately. He picked up his phone and called his luxury auto broker, ordering the exotic sports car for Tanya without a second thought. He felt like a generous, benevolent king rewarding his loyal subjects with the spoils of a conquered empire. He was perfectly content to let his sister drain the company coffers, because he fundamentally believed the coffers would soon be replenished by the global retail conglomerate. He watched Tanya squeal with delight and hug him tightly, entirely convinced he was the smartest, most powerful man in the city. They were all dancing wildly on the razor-thin edge of a colossal precipice. Darius, Chloe, and Tanya were completely blinded by their own greed and hubris. They had constructed a massive, towering house of cards built entirely on high-interest loans, forged reputations, and a severely flawed understanding of corporate law. They believed they had outsmarted me. They believed they had won the war and claimed the ultimate prize. They were so busy picking out custom leather interiors for their new cars and planning their private jet itineraries that they completely forgot to look down. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet was entirely hollow. They did not know that the $50 million buyout required exclusive rights to the chemical formulas. They did not know that the bridge loan would default the moment the conglomerate walked away. They did not know that the Buckhead mansion and the Onyx Beauty shares were already utterly worthless. They were gleefully spending millions of dollars they did not actually have secured by an empire they did not actually own. They were celebrating their absolute supremacy while standing directly over the dynamite. And I was waiting in the quiet shadows, perfectly still, holding the detonator. Darius continued to parade around the corporate headquarters as if he had single-handedly invented the cosmetics industry. He ordered a massive, expensive renovation of the executive suites, demanding custom artwork and imported hardwood floors. He held daily meetings with his bewildered marketing team, barking out vague, inspirational buzzwords while providing absolutely zero strategic direction. The employees who had actually respected my leadership and understood my contributions were forced to smile and nod as Darius took credit for years of my grueling, meticulous labor. He was a hollow vessel, demanding worship. He spent his afternoons playing golf at the exclusive country club, loudly discussing his $50 million valuation with anyone who would listen. He was desperate for validation, desperate to prove that he had never needed me. Chloe, meanwhile, treated the Onyx Beauty offices as her personal playground. She would arrive late in the morning carrying shopping bags from luxury boutiques, disrupting workflow to show off her new diamond bracelets to the receptionists. She began interfering with the brand aesthetics, demanding that packaging colors be changed to match her personal preferences. She acted as though she was the new creative director, despite having absolutely no experience in product design or consumer marketing. The two of them were a toxic, destructive force, rapidly eroding the professional culture I had carefully cultivated over a decade. They believed their sheer charisma and the promise of impending wealth shielded them from all consequences. Tanya drove her new imported sports car to the country club, parking it illegally in the VIP spots just to flaunt her elevated status. She spent her massively inflated salary on ostentatious jewelry and expensive lunches, treating her former friends with newfound condescension. She truly believed her vicious smear campaign had elevated her to the upper echelons of Atlanta society permanently. The three of them had formed a tight, impenetrable circle of narcissism, reinforcing each other's delusions of grandeur. They were entirely insulated from reality. They had borrowed against a future that was mathematically impossible to achieve. The private equity lenders were quietly monitoring the bridge loan, waiting for the first missed payment to seize the assets. The global retail conglomerate was assembling their team of forensic accountants to begin the deep dive into Onyx Beauty's intellectual property rights. The collision course was set. The massive $50 million mirage shimmered beautifully in the sweltering heat of the Atlanta summer, promising absolute salvation and limitless luxury. Darius Vance was the king of a magnificent glittering castle, completely unaware that the walls were made of dry sand and the tide was already rushing in. The night of the Victory Gala arrived with an oppressive, humid heat that clung to the Atlanta streets. But inside the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel, the air was perfectly chilled and fragrant with expensive floral arrangements. Darius had spared absolutely no expense for his public coronation. He had rented the most prestigious venue in the city, transforming the massive ballroom into a glittering monument to his own ego. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceilings, and towering crystal champagne towers anchored the corners of the room. The local press corps was out in full force, their camera flashes creating a relentless strobe light effect across the opulent space. Atlanta's elite society had turned out in droves, eager to rub shoulders with the man who had supposedly engineered a $50 million miracle. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided through the packed crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and perfectly seared Wagyu beef. Darius stood at the center of it all, radiating a sickening level of manufactured charm. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo with a diamond lapel pin that caught the light every time he turned for the cameras. Chloe clung tightly to his arm, wearing an ostentatious silver gown covered in hand-sewn sequins, soaking up the flashing bulbs and the envious stares of the women she had so recently desperately tried to emulate. The centerpiece of the entire evening was the raised stage constructed at the far end of the ballroom. A massive mahogany desk had been positioned directly in the center, flanked by two large digital screens displaying the Onyx Beauty logo, interwoven with the insignia of the global retail conglomerate. This was not just a celebration. It was a live televised execution of the $50 million contract. 4 high-ranking executives from the conglomerate sat in plush leather chairs on the stage, looking intensely pleased with their impending acquisition. They wore conservative dark suits and projected an aura of immense international wealth. Darius left Chloe's side and confidently climbed the short staircase to the stage. He took his position behind the mahogany desk, raising his hands to quiet the cheering crowd. He grabbed the gold-plated microphone and began delivering a deeply arrogant speech about perseverance, vision, and the heavy burden of genius. He thanked his loyal investors. He thanked his devoted sister Tanya, who was standing in the front row, wiping away theatrical tears of joy. He spoke grandly about the future of global beauty and his solo journey to the top of the corporate mountain. The executives beside him nodded approvingly, opening their expensive leather portfolios to retrieve the binding acquisition contracts. The $50 million mirage was seconds away from becoming a legally binding nightmare. At that exact moment, the heavy carved oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a violent echoing crack. The heavy thud of the solid wood hitting the marble walls severed the polite applause like a guillotine. The string quartet playing softly in the balcony abruptly stopped mid-measure. The collective gasp from 500 wealthy guests sucked the oxygen directly out of the massive room. The relentless popping of the camera flashes ceased entirely. The ballroom went dead silent. The silence was so profound, so heavy, that the clink of a single dropped champagne glass sounded like a gunshot. I stepped over the threshold and into the blinding light of the chandeliers. I did not wear the muted conservative colors of a defeated ex-wife. I wore a stunning floor-length power red gown that fit like a suit of armor. The silk fabric pooled at my feet and trailed behind me like a river of blood. It was a dress designed for absolute dominance. I wore no jewelry to distract from the sharp lines of the gown. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, flawless style. I looked exactly like royalty stepping into a conquered territory. I was not alone. DeAndre Vance walked firmly at my right side, his dark eyes scanning the frozen crowd with predatory amusement. He wore a pitch-black suit and carried his signature leather briefcase gripping the handle with white-knuckled intensity. Flanking us on either side and trailing slightly behind were 3 elite corporate auditors. They moved in perfect unison, wearing identical gray suits and carrying heavy metal lockboxes. They projected an aura of clinical, devastating authority. The crowd parted instantly as we began our descent down the long center aisle. The wealthy socialites who had spent the last month whispering vicious lies about my mental stability physically recoiled as I approached. They pressed themselves against the linen-draped tables, desperately trying to avoid making eye contact with the woman they had so eagerly buried. I kept my chin elevated and my gaze locked entirely on the stage. I did not acknowledge a single face in the crowd. The sheer force of my composure radiated through the room, completely shattering the fragile illusion Darius had paid millions of dollars to construct. The sea of imported silk and custom tuxedos split wide open, granting me an unobstructed path directly toward the mahogany desk. Tanya was the first person to break the paralyzing spell of the silent ballroom. She realized that her brother's perfect coronation was imploding right before her eyes. The sports car, the massive salary, and the newfound social status were all suddenly flashing before her panicked gaze. She broke away from the front row and lunged into the center aisle, frantically attempting to physically block my path. Her expensive designer heels slipped slightly on the polished marble floor, but she managed to plant herself directly in front of me. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. She hissed viciously, waving her arms and screaming for the private security guards to immediately intervene. She demanded that the unstable trespassers be thrown out into the street. She shouted that I was ruining the most important night of her family's life. I did not even break my stride. I did not blink. I did not look at her face. I looked straight through her as if she were made of transparent glass. DeAndre simply snapped his fingers. Two massive men from his own private security detail materialized from the shadows near the entrance. They moved with terrifying silent speed. Before Tanya could utter another hysterical demand, the two men flanked her. They gripped her arms gently, but with absolute unyielding firmness. They lifted her slightly off the marble floor and moved her aside like a minor irritating nuisance. They deposited her behind a towering floral arrangement, completely silencing her frantic protests. The entire physical interception took less than 4 seconds. I continued my slow, measured walk down the aisle, my red gown sweeping across the floor, leaving a wake of terrified silence behind me. The guests watched in absolute horror as the sister who had orchestrated the vicious whisper campaign was effortlessly swatted away. The sheer mechanics of power were on full display, and nobody in the room dared to step into the aisle to replace her. Darius stood frozen behind the mahogany desk. A thick bead of sweat rolled down his perfectly powdered forehead. The charismatic smile had completely melted off his face, revealing the terrified hollow fraud underneath. He gripped the gold-plated microphone so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He tried to laugh it off. He let out a loud, forced chuckle that echoed awkwardly through the dead-silent ballroom. He leaned into the microphone and told the global retail executives that this was just a minor distraction. He loudly demanded that hotel security immediately remove his unstable ex-wife, claiming I was suffering from a severe manic episode. His voice cracked. The confident baritone he had used just moments ago was replaced by a shrill, desperate pitch. The executives sitting beside him did not laugh. They did not call for security. They watched me approach with highly trained corporate instincts, recognizing instantly that the balance of power in the room had just violently shifted. I reached the base of the stage and climbed the short stairs without hesitating. My red gown flowed over the steps as I ascended into the blinding spotlight. Darius took a panicked step backward, bumping into the mahogany desk. I walked right past him. I completely ignored his frantic, stuttering demands. I walked straight up to the executives from the global retail conglomerate. They remained seated, but their postures were rigid with sudden tension. I focused my attention entirely on the man sitting at the far end. He was the lead legal counsel responsible for verifying the $50 million acquisition. He looked up at me with calculating eyes. I did not speak. I did not offer a greeting. I opened my sleek leather clutch and retrieved a single crisp sheet of paper. I extended my arm and handed the document directly to the lead counsel. He took the single sheet of thick linen paper from my hand. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the faint rustle of the paper between his fingertips. He lowered his eyes to read the bold black text. I watched his face closely. It took exactly 4 seconds for the arrogant corporate confidence to completely vanish from his features. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving his face an ashen, sickly gray. His eyes widened in absolute shock and his jaw slackened. He looked up at me and then looked frantically back down at the document as if hoping the words would magically change. They did not change. They were immutable, ironclad legal facts. He reacted with the speed of a man touching a burning stove. He lunged across the mahogany desk and violently yanked the thick stack of $50 million buyout contracts away from Darius. He pulled the document so aggressively that he knocked over a crystal water glass. The glass shattered against the polished wood, spilling ice and water across the pristine surface. He frantically shoved the contracts back into his leather portfolio, snapping the brass lock shut with a loud, definitive click. He stood up abruptly, pushing his heavy leather chair backward. Darius snapped out of his paralyzed stupor. The illusion of his absolute power shattered the moment the contracts were ripped from his grasp. He lunged forward, slamming his hands flat against the wet mahogany desk. He leaned toward the lead counsel, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He screamed into the dead, silent ballroom, his voice cracking with hysteria. He demanded to know what was going on. He demanded that the executives sign the paperwork immediately. He shouted that they had a verbal agreement and that this was a completely illegal breach of contract. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was feeding them fabricated lies. The lead counsel did not even look at Darius. He looked directly at the other 3 executives on the stage and gave them a single sharp nod. They all stood up in perfect unison, snapping their portfolios shut and stepping away from the desk. They looked at Darius with pure corporate disgust. They looked at him like he was a toxic liability. They began to rapidly pack their belongings, preparing to evacuate the ballroom before the fallout splashed onto their pristine, tailored suits. Darius grabbed the lead counsel by the sleeve of his expensive jacket, begging for an explanation. The counsel forcefully ripped his arm away, brushing his sleeve as if Darius had infected him with a disease. He leaned forward and spoke in a low, icy tone that carried through the entire front row. He told Darius that his firm did not purchase hollow shells and that they were officially terminating all negotiations immediately. Darius stumbled backward, as if he had been physically struck. He looked at me, his eyes wide with wild, desperate confusion. He still did not understand the magnitude of his destruction. He still thought this was just a minor legal hurdle he could charm his way out of. He grabbed the gold-plated microphone from the desk and turned to the bewildered crowd, attempting to salvage his glittering coronation. He forced a sickeningly fake laugh and started to tell the press that there was just a minor clerical error to sort out. He never finished the sentence. DeAndre stepped forward and smoothly snatched the microphone directly out of that trembling hand. The sudden, aggressive movement shocked Darius into silence. DeAndre stood at the center of the stage, radiating absolute power. He looked out at the sea of flashing cameras and wealthy investors. He tapped the microphone twice, ensuring the sound system was perfectly calibrated. His deep, authoritative voice boomed through the massive ballroom, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He announced that there was no clerical error. He announced that there would be no $50 million buyout tonight or any other night. He stated that the man standing behind the desk was attempting to execute the largest case of corporate fraud in the history of the Atlanta beauty industry. The crowd erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and frantic whispering. The journalists in the front row began furiously typing on their phones, recording every single word. DeAndre raised his hand, commanding absolute silence. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small black remote. He pointed it toward the back of the room and pressed a single button. The 2 massive digital screens flanking the stage suddenly flickered and changed. The Onyx Beauty logo vanished. In its place, a series of highly magnified, heavily redacted legal documents appeared on the screens. They were projected in crystal-clear high definition for every single person in the ballroom to read. The flashing cameras immediately pivoted from Darius to the glowing screens, capturing the irrefutable evidence of his impending ruin. DeAndre began to break down the exact DNA of the trap we had spent months meticulously constructing. He spoke with the clear, precise cadence of a trial lawyer delivering a closing argument. He pointed to the first document on the screen. He told the crowd that Darius Vance had indeed legally acquired 100% of the voting shares of Onyx Beauty LLC. He confirmed that the separation agreement Darius had so proudly paraded around town was entirely legitimate. Darius puffed out his chest, slightly clutching at that tiny shred of validation. He yelled out that he owned the company free and clear. He shouted that the documents proved he was the sole undisputed king of the brand. DeAndre let him yell. He let Darius dig his grave a few inches deeper. Then DeAndre pressed the button on his remote again. A new document flashed onto the screens. It was a transfer of intellectual property deed dated 3 full years ago. The dates were highlighted in bright, aggressive yellow. That deep voice dropped an octave, hitting a tone of lethal finality. He explained the fatal flaw in that grand illusion. He stated that while Darius owned the LLC itself was nothing but an empty, hollow shell. 3 years ago, acting with incredible foresight and absolute legal precision, I had transferred the patents for every single cosmetic formula into a completely separate legal entity. I had taken the chemical blueprints, the exact scientific recipes that made the luxury creams and serums actually work, and I had legally severed them from the Onyx Beauty corporate structure. I had moved them far beyond the reach of any future divorce settlement or hostile corporate takeover. DeAndre pressed the button again. A land deed appeared on the screen. He explained that it was not just the formulas. The actual physical land where the massive Onyx Beauty manufacturing plant sat had also been quietly transferred 3 years ago. The LLC did not own the ground it operated on. The LLC owned the brick-and-mortar building, but the soil beneath it belonged to someone else. Darius looked at the screens, his face twisting in absolute horror. He was finally beginning to understand the microscopic details of his slaughter. He looked at me, his lips moving silently, unable to form a coherent word. He was drowning in a sea of aggressive legal jargon, and he had absolutely no life preserver. DeAndre delivered the final devastating blow. He pointed to the top of the documents, highlighting the name of the separate legal entity that held all the true value. He announced the name loud and clear. It was the Aaliyah Legacy Trust. I had named the impenetrable financial fortress after my daughter. I had secured her future and weaponized her legacy in a single brilliant maneuver. The crowd was completely captivated, hanging on every single syllable. The silence was absolute. DeAndre looked directly at Darius and spelled out the humiliation in agonizingly clear terms. He explained that Onyx Beauty did not own its own products. The company merely leased the exclusive rights to manufacture and distribute those products from the Aaliyah Legacy Trust. The lease agreement was legally binding, but it contained a very specific, highly aggressive termination clause. The lease could be revoked at any time for any reason by the sole executor of the trust. DeAndre turned slowly and gestured toward me. He announced to the entire room that I was the creator, the funder, and the sole undisputed executor of the Aaliyah Legacy Trust. I held absolute dictatorial control over the chemical formulas and the manufacturing land. Those weak knees physically buckled. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany desk to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, hollow ghost. The $50 million retail conglomerate executives were standing at the edge of the stage, watching the absolute annihilation of the man who had just tried to scam them. Darius Vance was completely destroyed forever. The silence in the grand ballroom was finally broken by a visceral, guttural sound erupting from deep within Darius. It was the sound of a man watching his entire universe collapse into ash. He shoved himself off the mahogany desk, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a trembling finger at DeAndre and screamed that this was a massive illegal conspiracy. He shouted that the trust was a fraudulent sham constructed to steal his hard-earned corporate assets. He paced back and forth across the stage like a trapped animal, spewing empty legal threats to the silent, bewildered crowd. He bellowed that he was taking us to the highest court in the state. He roared that he was Aaliyah's father, and therefore he had an absolute legal right to manage his daughter's financial interests. He screamed that no judge in the entire country would ever allow a bitter ex-wife to block a loving father from accessing his own child's legacy trust. He slammed his fist against the desk, demanding the global retail executives sit back down and ignore this pathetic domestic squabble. He was gasping for air, his bespoke tuxedo suddenly looking suffocatingly tight as he threatened to sue me for every single dime I possessed. He shrieked that he would hire an entire army of vicious litigators to rip the trust apart piece by piece until he reclaimed his throne. I stepped gracefully toward the center of the stage. I reached out and gently took the gold-plated microphone from DeAndre's hand. The cold metal felt perfectly balanced against my palm. The ballroom lights reflected off my red silk gown as I turned to face my ex-husband. My voice when I spoke was not loud or hysterical. It was chillingly calm. It rang through the silent ballroom with the devastating clarity of a death sentence. I looked directly into his panicked eyes and told him he was fundamentally incorrect. I told him he had absolutely zero legal rights to the Aaliyah Legacy Trust. I told him he had no standing in any court of law to challenge my authority or touch a single penny of those assets. I reached into the sleek leather clutch resting at my side. I withdrew a thick stack of folded documents. The heavy parchment paper crackled sharply in the quiet room. I held the paperwork up for the flashing cameras and the stunned crowd to witness. I announced that this was the final officially certified divorce decree and custody arrangement. I unfolded the pages and turned directly to the signature lines. I projected my voice perfectly, ensuring every single journalist and society elite heard the undeniable truth. I stated that Darius was not Aaliyah's father in any legal capacity whatsoever. I explained with surgical precision how he had explicitly, voluntarily, and legally relinquished all parental rights. I told the crowd exactly why he had done it. I revealed that he had severed all emotional and financial ties to his sick child solely to avoid paying a single cent of child support. I explained how he had prioritized his own personal wealth and his new mistress over the medical needs of his own daughter. I stated clearly that a superior court judge had signed off on the total severance of his rights 30 days ago at his own aggressive insistence. He had legally erased himself from her life to save his bank account. Therefore, he had legally, completely, permanently erased himself from her multi-million-dollar trust fund. He had abandoned his daughter, and in doing so, he had abandoned the only key to the Onyx Beauty empire. Every word was a razor blade slicing through his carefully crafted public persona until nothing but the ugly truth remained. Darius stumbled backward, clutching his chest as if he were having a physical heart attack. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified hollow ghost. He realized the sheer magnitude of the trap he had sprinted into. The custody waiver he thought was his greatest victory, the document he had celebrated signing, the paper he had used to laugh at my supposed defeat, was actually the exact instrument of his total annihilation. He had literally signed away his empire to save a few $1,000s in monthly child support. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing sound emerged. He looked out at the crowd, searching for any sign of sympathy, any shred of support. He found absolutely nothing. The faces of his wealthy peers were twisted in absolute disgust. The room full of high society elites recoiled from him not just as a failed businessman, but as a monstrous deadbeat father who had discarded his own sick child. DeAndre smoothly took the microphone back from my hand. He was not finished. The trap still had one final devastating mechanism waiting to be triggered. DeAndre looked at the global retail executives who were now standing near the stage exit, completely appalled by the spectacle. He confirmed loudly that the $50 million buyout deal was officially permanently dead. The executives nodded in stern agreement, their faces locked in expressions of absolute corporate disdain. Then DeAndre turned back to the massive digital screens. He pressed the remote and a new financial ledger appeared in bright, aggressive red text. He dropped the final bomb onto the ruins of Darius's ego. He made sure the press corps got a perfect view of the staggering numbers. He announced that Onyx Beauty, LLC, was not just a hollow shell, it was an entity drowning in massive delinquent debt. He stated that the company was currently in severe breach of its primary leasing contract. Because Darius had spent the last month playing king and completely ignoring the actual operational accounts, he had failed to pay the required monthly licensing fees for the chemical formulas. DeAndre spelled it out with brutal arithmetic clarity. Onyx Beauty owed the Aaliyah Legacy Trust exactly $5 million in unpaid back licensing fees and punitive breach of contract penalties. The debt was due immediately in full. If the $5 million was not deposited into the trust account within 48 hours, the Aaliyah Legacy Trust would completely revoke all manufacturing rights and officially seize all remaining Onyx Beauty physical assets to satisfy the massive debt. The brand would be liquidated to pay the trust. The ruin was absolute. The psychological devastation finally caught up with the financial reality. Darius stood frozen on the stage, his mind desperately trying to process the catastrophic math. He realized with terrifying clarity that he was not just broke, he was millions of dollars in the red. He remembered the highly aggressive predatory bridge loan he had signed just a few weeks ago. He had leveraged his sprawling Buckhead mansion and his entire portfolio of Onyx Beauty shares to borrow millions of dollars in liquid cash. He had spent that borrowed money on Italian marble vintage champagne custom sports cars and a ludicrous European victory tour. He had wagered everything he owned against a company that was fundamentally, utterly worthless. The private equity firm would demand immediate repayment the second the news of the collapse buyout hit the financial wire. When he failed to pay, they would immediately seize the mansion. They would seize his cars. They would seize everything he had ever valued. He had handed me the chemical formulas, he had handed me full custody of our daughter, and he had successfully bankrupted himself in the process. The global retail executives did not say a single word. They simply turned their backs on the stage and walked out of the ballroom, their heavy security detail clearing a swift path through the stunned crowd. Their departure signaled the official, absolute end of the illusion. The press corps erupted into an absolute frenzy. The flashing camera bulbs became a blinding, relentless strobe light, capturing every single angle of Darius's public humiliation. Journalists shouted aggressive questions, demanding comments on the abandoned child, the forged reputation, and the massive impending bankruptcy. I looked down at the front row where Chloe was standing. She was staring up at Darius in sheer, unfiltered horror. The reality of her situation was crashing down around her. She had attached herself to a rising star, only to realize it was a rapidly descending meteor. She had spent the last month reveling in stolen luxury, demanding custom jewelry and redesigning a mansion she would now never own. She saw the $50 million mirage evaporate, leaving behind a mountain of predatory debt and a publicly disgraced pariah. She looked at me, her eyes wide with absolute terror, realizing that she was permanently financially shackled to a ruined man who had absolutely nothing left to his name. I held her cold gaze for a tiny fraction of a second, allowing her to fully absorb the absolute totality of my grand victory before turning my back on her forever. The fallout was swift and merciless. The financial vultures did not wait for the morning news to pick apart the carcass of Darius Vance's fabricated empire. Within 48 hours, the predatory lenders moved in with lethal precision. They executed the aggressive default clauses and immediately foreclosed on the sprawling Buckhead mansion. The heavy iron gates were chained shut, and neon eviction notices were slapped across the custom doors. Darius watched his entire world evaporate. He tried calling his friends, but every single contact went straight to voicemail. Atlanta high society completely erased him. Chloe did not stick around. She was a parasite seeking the warmest host, and the temperature around Darius had dropped below freezing. In the dead of night, while Darius was passed out on the floor of a cheap motel room, she silently packed every designer bag and piece of jewelry she could carry. She did not leave a note. She loaded her heavy luggage into a rideshare and vanished into the night. When Darius woke up and tried calling her, he found his number permanently blocked. She completely scrubbed him from her life, moving on to find her next victim. Tanya's inevitable destruction took a few days longer but was equally devastating. The whisper campaign she maliciously orchestrated against me completely backfired. The corporate world realized she was a toxic liability who actively participated in a massive fraud scheme. She was permanently blacklisted from every firm in the city. Facing total financial ruin and massive personal debt, she resorted to an act of pure pathetic desperation. She showed up unannounced at my sleek new corporate headquarters. My new office occupied the entire top floor of a prestigious downtown high-rise. The security guards had explicit instructions regarding unwanted visitors, but I allowed them to send Tanya up. I wanted to witness the final chapter of her humiliation. She walked into my immaculate office weeping hysterically. Her designer clothes were heavily wrinkled and her flawless makeup was smeared across her cheeks. She collapsed into one of the leather chairs across from my desk, begging for mercy. She cried that she was broke, that she was going to lose her condo, and desperately needed a job. I sat perfectly still behind my polished marble desk, letting her sob. I did not offer a tissue. I did not offer a word of comfort. I simply opened my desk drawer and retrieved a manila folder. I slid the dossier across the smooth surface until it rested in front of her trembling hands. Tanya stopped crying and looked down. She opened the folder and the color drained from her face. Inside was a meticulous trail of proof detailing her extensive corporate embezzlement. It contained bank statements, falsified invoices, and wire transfers proving she had been siphoning money for years. I looked at her terrified face and delivered my final ultimatum. My voice was chillingly calm, completely devoid of any emotion. I told her to leave my office before I called the police and handed the dossier directly to the district attorney. Tanya did not say a single word. She scrambled out of the chair, dropping her purse on the floor. She grabbed it and ran out of the office, sprinting down the hallway like a frightened animal. I never saw or heard from her again. With the parasites totally eradicated, I focused entirely on building my empire. I executed my legal authority and permanently revoked Onyx Beauty's licensing rights. The brand instantly dissolved into absolute nothingness. I took back the manufacturing plant, the chemical formulas, and the pristine land. I completely remodeled the massive factory, wiping away every trace of the old toxic brand. I launched a vibrant new cosmetic powerhouse and named it Aaliyah's Crown. The rebranding was a massive, undeniable global success. Investors flocked to the new transparent entity, and our quarterly profits shattered every industry record. The brand stood for unyielding strength. 6 months later, I sat in my sprawling corner office, overlooking the glittering Atlanta skyline. The afternoon sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the sleek, modern space in warm golden light. In the corner of the office, at a custom-designed miniature drafting table, sat my daughter Aaliyah. She was happily painting a vibrant watercolor, completely healthy and thriving. The cutting-edge medical treatments funded by her trust had completely cured her severe illness. She hummed a joyful little tune, completely oblivious to the brutal war I had waged and won to secure her future. I smiled, watching her mix bright colors on her palette. The quiet peace of the moment was interrupted by a soft ping from my laptop. I glanced at the screen. An email had bypassed my strict spam filters. It was from a generic free account, but the subject line betrayed the sender immediately. It was a desperate, rambling message from Darius. The preview text showed him begging for a second chance, pleading to see his daughter, and apologizing for his catastrophic mistakes. He was begging for a tiny scrap of the life he had so arrogantly thrown away. I did not read a single word of his pathetic apologies. I felt absolutely zero pity or regret. My finger hovered over the trackpad for a fraction of a second before I clicked block. I permanently deleted the message, erasing his digital existence from my world. I closed my laptop with a satisfying snap. The corporate battlefield was silent and the victory absolute. I stood up, the heavy burden of the past finally lifted from my shoulders. I walked across the sunlit room, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. I knelt beside Aaliyah's table, wrapping my arms around her shoulders. I kissed the top of her head, inhaling the sweet scent of her shampoo. She looked up with bright eyes and showed me her painting. It was a beautiful, vibrant masterpiece. I held my daughter close, knowing her crown was secured forever. It was a total, flawless victory.